You're joining us during such a tumultuous time, and we hope that all of you are safe and well. This installment of 350 Humboldt Speaker Series features researcher and congressional aide Ciara Emery. Ciara will talk with us about her research on stakeholder perceptions of offshore wind energy development locally, providing some context on the offshore wind development process and climate considerations. Some logistics. Because so many people signed up, we need to conduct this event as a webinar rather than a discussion, so you'll be muted throughout. So all questions will go to me via chat, and I will direct some questions to Ciara verbally. This is going to be a pretty academic talk, so please do ask clarifying questions throughout via the chat. But please limit clarifying questions to things like, what does that acronym stand for? What is the label on that axis? We will have a Q&A starting around 7:45 or 8 o'clock. So save in-depth or open-ended questions until this time. We will be recording this talk, and it will be available on our website. So my name is Katie Gurin, and I'm on the steering committee of 350 Humboldt. I want to thank EPIC, the Climate Action Campaign of the Humboldt Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, Humboldt Friends, 11th Hour, and the Coalition for Responsible Transportation Priorities for co-sponsoring this event. I also want to thank fellow steering committee member Pat and core member Val for organizing and promotion. Lastly, I want to thank our speaker, of course, Ciara Emery. Ciara graduated with high honors from Humboldt State University, where she received a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's degree in social science. In her professional life, she's a local field representative for Congressman Jared Huffman. All right, I will hand things over to Ciara.
Thanks so much, Katie. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. Okay. So I'm just going to share my screen. So again, thanks for coming on. I know that there has been a lot of stuff around offshore wind in the last couple of days. Well, the last couple of weeks, and for some of you, the last couple of years. So appreciate you hopping on today. Again, my name is Ciara Emery. I am an HSU alumni, and I'm presenting today on my thesis research titled Bringing Climate Change Home to Meet Your Community, Stakeholder Perceptions of Offshore Wind Energy Development in Humboldt County, California. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, let me just collapse that window there. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to acknowledge where this research is situated today, go over some considerations for offshore wind, talk about where development is currently at in Humboldt County, and then I'll dive into what my methods were for this thesis work, my findings. I'll do just a little bit of analysis and discussion, and then we'll conclude with some Q&A. So save your questions for the end. Again, if there's some clarifying questions, happy to answer them, but hopefully we'll have some good Q&A at the end. So just to start off with some acknowledgements, again, this is my thesis research. So this was my culminating project for my master's degree at HSU. I have an MA in social science from the Environment and Community program. The project was also funded by the Schatz Energy Research Center, who had a grant from the Ocean Protection Council. So if some folks have been attending the Schatz Energy Research Center webinars, a lot of this is going to be pretty familiar to you. I was a co-author on their stakeholder chapter for their big socioeconomic, or their big offshore wind feasibility, I should say. So I want to, because they are connected, I want to talk really quickly about the differences. So if some folks attended the webinar earlier today or are familiar with the Schatz work, the key differences here are, again, all of this work is what I conducted personally for my thesis project. So the Schatz webinar and the shots study has a higher amount of stakeholders that were engaged and some separate stakeholder work that was conducted, and it was conducted not by me. So that's part of a larger stakeholder analysis, and this is the piece that I did personally. So if you attended the shots webinar earlier today and some of the numbers are a little bit different, that's why. The other thing is that my thesis is a little bit more theoretical than the shots piece. So there's a third question that I ask, and I'll go over all of this, but there's a third question that I ask about the ways that climate change interacts with the development process, and you won't find that in the shots research. So they are connected, but this explores what I did for my thesis project specifically, so there are some differences there. So to kind of jump into considerations for offshore wind in the US, 83% of Americans support increased development of wind farms in the United States. However, when you start to have an actual project, when you have a development plan in your community, statistics on that get a lot more complicated. So, you know, for instance, the Cape Wind Project, which was an offshore wind project proposal off the coast of Massachusetts. A lot of people are familiar with the Cape Wind Project. When they were first chatting about offshore wind off the coast of Massachusetts, 55% of people surveyed, specifically in 2002, said, hey, that sounds like a great idea. Just 4 years later, around 55% of people were opposed to the project. So in a 4-year time span, that Cape Wind Project went from being generally popular to pretty unpopular. And as a lot of you may know, that project failed. Now, what I will mention about that project is a lot of people think that Cape Wind was unsuccessful because of this idea that you have these rich landowners who didn't want to see the turbines offshore. Some of that plays a role, but the most cited opposition was actually wildlife impacts for the Cape Wind project. It was wildlife impacts, and then viewshed, and then recreational and commercial fishing industry impacts. So these projects, these offshore wind projects, can be pretty dynamic. They can be pretty complicated. And while renewable energy has a broad amount of support, we shouldn't bank on that as it being easy to develop. So I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the offshore projects in the US. This is not an exhaustive list, but I should say that the only commercial project, offshore project in the US is the Block Island, Rhode Island project. This is a 30 megawatt project with 5 turbines in Rhode Island. It's relatively on the small side compared to some of some current developer proposals. But again, this is the only commercial operating project in the United States. Floating wind and offshore wind in general is more common in Europe, where there are plenty of other examples. Again, the Cape Wind project off the coast of Massachusetts, I would say, is the most well-known or the most infamous project. A lot of people know of its failure. That is a relinquished lease, but the response to the failure of the Cape Wind project is the Vineyard Power project in Massachusetts. And that's an interesting project because it's a community cooperative local ownership paradigm. And so Vineyard Power said, well, the whole Cape Wind thing didn't go too well. So maybe we should come up with a way to engage stakeholders and engage the fishing community and engage environmental organizations. And maybe we'll come up with this community cooperative local ownership paradigm. And I'll talk a little bit about local ownership a little bit later. But again, this was a response to Cape Wind. And so all 3 of these things are on the East Coast, and Vineyard Wind has not been built yet. So some of the considerations, and some of this is in the literature, basically, if I am a developer and I want to build an offshore wind project, I've got to go through the federal leasing process. That's through the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And there are two prongs, two routes that you can take to get your idea considered by BOEM. And the first one is an unsolicited lease request. That's where a developer says, hey, we think we've got this great idea, you guys should consider it. And it has to be not competitive. They have to say, we don't think anybody else is interested in this particular piece of ocean. The second part is, the second route, I should say, is the competitive commercial leasing process. And so that's when the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management does a bunch of public meetings and then issues a call for information and nominations. So they create this area where they say, hey, we could think about doing leases. Developers, what do you guys think? And so then they take bids, competitive bids for pieces of federal ocean. So you've got to operate within that process. And within that process, there's a couple of different rounds of environmental review that has to occur. So that's the second consideration. In California, a project would have to go through both the National Environmental Policy Act and the California Environmental Quality Act. So those are your NEPA, CEQA environmental review processes. And those are processes where developers and the community can come together and chat about potential mitigation plans and have some public engagement. But after the environmental review, say you've got a lease, you've done some environmental review, you still have to do all your state and local permitting. There's a ton of permitting agencies. I really won't go into all of that right now. But just because you obtain a lease from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management doesn't mean that you can ship all your stuff out tomorrow and set up your wind array. There's a lot of both NEPA CEQA work that you have to do and permitting work. Next, you have to think about your community work. And so there's a lot of really interesting literature about place attachment and development projects and the ways that communities feel about the ways that development projects can change their environment, and they either feel really great about it or they feel not so great about it. And so there's a lot of interesting literature about the ways that developers and elected officials and folks who want to build things, the ways that they should approach communities. And so if you're not familiar with this research, and if you listened to the SHOTS webinar earlier, you'll know that this is really important to consider. And next, you'll also want to consider, you'll have to consider engagement by and with Native American tribes. So tribes have a unique legal ability to affect development processes. I'm thinking particularly of the National Historic Preservation Act and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And so if we're going back to the Cape Wind scenario, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and the Mashpee Wampanoag of Gay Head sued the developers, and I believe the federal government maybe, over the development of that project because they said that the viewshed was of cultural importance to them. And so they were able to slow down and throw that project into litigation for quite some time. And some researchers believe that that was just another reason why that project failed. So it's very, very important for developers to consider existing federal law and going beyond existing federal law to make sure that tribes are engaged in these development projects. So talking about offshore wind in Humboldt County specifically, what has occurred here is in 2016, Trident Wind, which is a wind developing company, submitted an unsolicited lease request for a lease off of the Central Coast. And they did that because they thought, as I said before, they thought they had the tools and the technology to make that work. And so when they did that, they triggered an intergovernmental task force that was led by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the California state government, California Energy Commission, and others. And during that task force, that really kind of kicked off a lot of the key conversations about offshore wind on the West Coast. And the reason it's taken so long is because you cannot have fixed bottom turbines on the West Coast. Our ocean is too deep here, where there's a lot of room on the East Coast to be able to just put your turbine right in the seabed. We really can't do that on the West Coast. So you have to have a floating platform. And so here we've got a picture of Principal Power's floating array, and you can see how big these things are. These are people, if you didn't see, under the big floating platform. This is Principal Power's design, which is one of the engineering firms that has been having conversations on the North Coast. So as this technology has increased, as the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management began to realize that people are interested in offshore wind on the West Coast, another wrench was thrown in, and that is the Department of Defense. So the Department of Defense said, whoa, hold up. This is an interesting conversation, but we've got a lot of military resources off the West Coast, and we don't know that you can just put a wind array wherever. And so they released a couple versions of this map where basically all of California was red, and then our little area on the North Coast was green. And that was supposed to signify that the DoD had issues with the rest of California, but developers could go up north. And they have since revised that map, and there have been different maps that have been released since then. The Department of Defense never really likes to relinquish their say in things. So those consultations with the Department of Defense are continuing today. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has released call areas for Northern California and Central California. They are going to start an auction process, but that auction process has been delayed, partly due, arguably, to the US election, and also due to these ongoing conversations with the Department of Defense. So while all of this is happening, our consortium here, our little Redwood Coast Energy Authority, they realized that we have really, really, really good wind offshore, and they knew that there was these existing conversations that were happening where there was going to be some attention to the North Coast on building a project. So the Redwood Coast Energy Authority released a request for qualifications and said, hey, is there anybody who's interested in working with us to pursue our own unsolicited lease to request? So around 2018, 2019, you had these dueling processes occurring where the Redwood Coast Energy Authority and their partners were doing their own stakeholder work to obtain an unsolicited lease request, to submit their unsolicited lease request, I should say. And the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management was also doing their own stakeholder work on their commercial leasing process. So these things were happening at the same time. Again, this is around 2017 and 2018. And that's when we were conducting the research for our study. So this is the Northern California call area. If you attended the webinar earlier, you had seen a similar map, but this is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's map. So that's where they're considering lease blocks now. And I have heard that it will potentially be 3 lease blocks in this area, depending on developer interest and what the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management decides to do. So this goes into, what did I do? So my thesis research answers 3 questions. The first one is, what do stakeholders perceive as the benefits and concerns of offshore wind energy in Humboldt County? The second one is, how do stakeholders feel about the process, the development process so far? And the third question, as I mentioned in the beginning, is a more theoretical question about how does the reality of climate change and stakeholder perceptions of climate change impact their perceptions of a potential wind project. And what I mean by that is, how do stakeholders incorporate their beliefs about climate change into their feelings about a potential renewable energy project? So I'm going to go into all of these right now. So what I did was I did 26 semi-structured interviews for the thesis work. Again, there are more interviews for the Schatz work. I just want to make sure everybody's clear on that. Semi-structured interviews are just, I can change the questions as I'm interviewing somebody depending on what they say to me. So they're just an informal kind of interview process. So I interviewed 5 people from the energy industry, 4 people from local government, 9 people from environmental groups, 7 people from the fishing industry, and 2 people associated with labor. Now, if you've got good eyes, you know that this actually equals 27. One person I interviewed talked to me both about the fishing industry and the labor side of things. So I included that person twice. Next, I did participant observation, which just means that I attended public meetings that were occurring on the North Coast primarily. Those were 14 public meetings. And again, those were between 2018 and 2019. And I attended 2 industry conferences. Those conferences were hosted by the Pacific Ocean Energy Trust. One of them was in Sacramento, and one of them was in Portland, Oregon. And finally, I did some document analysis, and that just means that I read the BOEM leasing documents and other materials submitted either in public comment or submitted by state or federal agencies that helped supplement what I knew about what was going on. So jumping into the results here, 20 out of 26 stakeholders interviewed said that climate change or fossil fuel reduction was a potential benefit of an offshore wind energy project. 15 out of 26 said that jobs and economic benefits were a benefit. 12 out of 26 said that energy independence or local control was a benefit. 11 out of 26 said that port revitalization was a benefit. And finally, 5 out of 26 said that less visual or environmental impacts from a project were a benefit, as in perhaps the project being offshore means that there are less negative impacts as opposed to it being onshore. So the other thing that we looked at when we were talking about benefits is community benefits agreements. A community benefits agreement can be formalized in the BOEM leasing process. And so we asked stakeholders if you had a written agreement with a developer, what would that look like? And so that's an interesting kind of category, because the fishing stakeholders would tell you, right, that they would rather have no project than any kind of monetary or other benefit. They would rather something not be built than have this conversation about auxiliary benefits. A lot of the other stakeholders felt like it could be an opportunity to do a variety of different things. One of the fishermen, I'll just say before I go on to what those things are, one of the fishermen told me, obviously, we've got to get all these folks in line with the concept of you pay to play. You're not here to just extract resources from us. Even though that resource is this thing you can't see way offshore, do the right thing. And so fishermen, while they would rather not have a project, if a project is going to be built, there better be some sort of benefit to the fishing community. And so some of those benefits could be mandatory safety trainings, paying for those, paying for federal life raft inspections. These things benefit fishermen, matching funds for development projects, the building of ice and cold storage or the funding of it, harbor dredging, and bay improvement and brownfield cleanup. So again, these are just things that stakeholders said perhaps could be incentivized with the development project here. So moving on to concerns, 22 out of 26 stakeholders said they were concerned about environmental impacts. And I'm going to piece those out in the next slide. 18 out of 26 stakeholders said they were concerned about impacts to fishermen or the fishing fleet. Now, these were much more than just the fishermen interviewed. So across the board, folks in every stakeholder category felt like it was a concern. Impacts to the fishing community were a concern. 9 out of 26 stakeholders were concerned about a change of scale. Now, a change of scale was mostly described to me as perhaps a developer comes in and they think they want to do something similar to Block Island, which is 30 megawatts and 5 turbines. But then they realize that perhaps that's not economically feasible. So they have to up the amount of megawatts and the amount of turbines to perhaps somewhere around 15 turbines. And what say does the community have if the developer has to up the amount of turbines, and what impact does that then have? And then finally, 6 out of 26 stakeholders were concerned about the cost, both the cost of the project and the cost of the energy received from the project. So moving into environmental concerns, 16 out of 26 stakeholders were concerned about impacts to marine mammals. 14 out of 26 were concerned about impacts to avian species. 12 out of 26 were concerned about the impacts to fish populations. And 9 out of 26 just said generally they were concerned about environmental impacts. They did not specify. So I want to briefly talk about the fishing industry in depth. Like I said, at least one person out of every stakeholder category was concerned about the impacts to the fishing fleet. Fishermen are concerned about a variety of different things. They're concerned about a loss of fishing ground, fishermen then competing for less ocean space to fish in. Fishermen were concerned about the entanglement on the wind array itself and whether or not they would be held accountable be placed accountable for that entanglement. Fishermen were concerned about the ways that the fish could be impacted by the noise or the electromagnetic waves from the sea cable. They were concerned about their ability to fish around the cable and if the cable would mess up their gear potentially. They're concerned about their access to and from the harbor and through the bay channel. You have to go in and out of the bay at certain times. And so they don't need the bay and the channel more crowded than it already is. And they're also concerned about the availability of bay real estate and the fact that some of their gear to date has already been moved around unwantingly. So what they told me was the realities are the fishing industry needs some really bitchin' lobbyists. They said, look, we're going to all of these meetings, we're writing op-eds, we're trying to talk to all of these developers, we're trying to communicate to folks what our concerns are, and we feel like there's all these other things that are already impacting our industry, like climate change, like MPAs, like ocean acidification and other things. And this is just another thing in the drop of the hat that is impacting our industry, and how much resources do we have to keep fighting this stuff? And so it's a really big strain on them. I should say though, before I go on to visual impacts, that not all stakeholders interviewed expressed a concern about the fishing industry. The majority did, but one elected official told me that they said, quote, "I hope they see that there's a lot of writing on the wall for them, that the fishing industry is not going to be around for much longer, so we have to be radical," end quote. So some folks, particularly in the environmental community, and this particular government official felt like perhaps the risks of climate change were too great to consider a lot of the adverse impacts to the fishing industry. But that is not the majority of the views. Like I said, most people were really receptive to the concerns of the fishing industry. Moving on to visual impacts, I want to be really clear about this. If you saw the SHOTS webinar earlier, they had some really awesome visualizations of what the wind array, I should say, would look like offshore, and what the turbines would look like in the Bay. And I believe that Arnie Jacobson, director of the SHOTS Energy Research Center, said that those visualizations were on the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's website. But when we did this work in, again, 2018 and 2019, those kind of visualizations did not exist. And so when we talked to stakeholders about their concerns about the visual impacts, most of it was inconclusive. It was mentioned by a handful of people, but most of the people who mentioned visual impacts were concerned that other people would be concerned about visual impacts. Only a couple were actually personally concerned about the visual impacts. One of those people said, I mean, there's something so fundamental to how humans relate to and view the ocean. And to mar that vista in any way, it seems like, not to be romantic and poetic, but I mean, it does seem like it could have a really profound impact on people's ocean-going experience. And so I just wanted to emphasize that, because while there was only a couple people that I interviewed that were concerned about this, several more were concerned about a potential concern. And this is really a category where, as in the Cape Wind case, visual impacts are politicized, and visual impacts are used by both project proponents and opponents. And this is really a category that could shift very radically as we learn more about what a wind array might look like offshore, or perhaps it couldn't. So I just want to be really clear. People's views shift, and this is a snapshot between 2018 and 2019. And it'll be interesting to see how this conversation about visual impacts evolves. So moving on to the second question of my thesis, which is about the process itself. So the BOEM leasing process, stakeholders said, was confusing. They said that BOEM showed this notorious flow chart in almost a majority of its public meetings between 2018 and 2019. And it was supposed to visualize their leasing process, and it was supposed to be a really clear way for them to explain what they were going to do. Stakeholders did not feel that way. Stakeholders did not feel like they really understood what the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management was trying to do up here. And they also felt like the number of meetings, and not that there was an issue with the number of meetings, but that the meetings themselves were kind of superficial, that they felt like the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management was just checking a box as opposed to meaningfully learning from the community and meaningfully shaping the process in a way that takes into consideration community's concerns. Now, I'm not saying that that was the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's intention, but that's how stakeholders perceived that process. The second kind of theme from the development section of my thesis is clarity and transparency. Again, folks felt like the leasing process was confusing, and some folks felt like the process was confusing on purpose, that these bureaucratic processes, they never make any sense, and they never adequately incorporate people, and none of it's accessible, and all of it's in legalese and jargon, and there's no real way for the community to insert itself, is what stakeholders told me. And that was an area that they would really like to see improved. And then the third theme is local relationships. One fisherman told me that it would be super great if they had a problem with whatever was happening with the wind array, they could just march into the local office and yell at the director, who was also a local person. It would not be so great if they had to call an 800 number and yell into somebody's voicemail on the East Coast. And so the community really liked this idea of having somebody locally who has ownership or has a stake or has an ability to affect the process and a real tangible way for the community to be involved in that development. And this kind of ties into what Vineyard Wind is trying to do in Massachusetts. They tried to come up with this way to literally create community ownership so that local people were invested in the project themselves. Finally, I'll go on to tribal perspectives. So Schatz Energy Research Center did tribal engagement after I concluded my work with them. So they had a couple of meetings with local tribes. They talk more about that in their write-up of their report. But based off of what tribes have said publicly, the benefits of the project are absolutely renewable energy generation. The Wiyot tribe supported RCEA's effort to obtain an unsolicited lease request with a support letter that they released. But there were some concerns, and California tribes listed various concerns that were noted by the state. Those are religious and cultural importance, either of the viewshed or the rock outcroppings or other things, impact to resources, confidentiality of data collection. Some tribes' relationship, most tribes' relationship with the federal government is often very fraught. And so it's not always an easy partnership, sharing data back and forth. Like I said, impacts to rock outcrops and geography, and then impacts to future generations. If they agree to a development project, how is the future of the tribe benefiting? In terms of the process, again, if you attended the webinar earlier, Jana Gagnon of the Blue Lake Rancheria tribe was there, and she said that she felt like the process so far was actually pretty extensive, that tribes have been engaged with the offshore wind process for several years now. They are members of the intergovernmental task force that was established in 2016. They have been engaged in closed door meetings and public meetings. There are a couple key ways though, a couple key things that could be improved, I should say. Number one is, if you are a non-federally recognized tribe, I don't think that you're on the intergovernmental task force, and the federal government certainly doesn't include you in a lot of their processes. The California state government legally has to include you. So there's this tension between what the state legally has to do and what the federal government has to do when it comes to non-federally recognized tribes. Second, federal law, going back to those acts that I told you, the Graves and Repatriation Acts, in many ways, tribes have to be consulted, but that doesn't necessarily mean that developers have to include their mitigation ideas. So it's one of those check mark scenarios where, you know, the federal government can say, well, we had 40 meetings and they went really well. And the tribe might say, okay, but you didn't do anything that we asked you to do. And that always leads to conflict. And so those development processes need to be improved. And so going on to the third part of my thesis, which is what I call the climate though, it goes back to that theme about the ways that stakeholders use their beliefs of climate change to inform their perceptions of offshore wind in Humboldt. And there are three themes. There are three ways that stakeholders did this. The first theme is some stakeholders, and these are a couple of environmental stakeholders who said the urgency of climate change supersedes some of the negative impacts or all of the negative impacts of a development project. So they would rather see something built than get murdered in all these conversations about impacts from the array itself. These are a minority of stakeholders interviewed, just a handful, a couple of environmental stakeholders and a government official. The second theme, and this is also a minority of stakeholders interviewed, said that the disproportionate impacts of project development meant that it was not worth it. So that's the flip side of the first theme. They said, and this is primarily fishermen, they said, why should we take a hit, quote, a hit, because everybody has contributed to climate change. So they said, we are so adversely impacted by this project that climate change is not a good enough reason to do it. And fishermen will tell you that they see firsthand what the impacts of climate change are, how they're manifesting currently. They'll say ocean acidification. They'll say climate change impacts how, when, and where I can fish. So I already see it. And this is just another thing that's hurting my industry. The third theme, and this is the majority of stakeholders interviewed, there was just a massive amount of uncertainty. Folks couldn't provide tangible examples about how they should weigh the impact from climate change and a wind development project offshore. They weren't sure how, for instance, how much wildlife impacts were okay to make the project benefits worth it. And so this is where we get into really interesting territory, because Humboldt County will tell you that it's a very environmentally minded county. But just because we're an environmentally minded county, just because, again, 83% of Americans say that they support the development of offshore wind, that doesn't mean that we're settled in any sort of way about how that wind gets built, who benefits from that wind, who is disproportionately impacted from that wind array, and how we decide as a community what sacrifices we're going to make to mitigate climate change. And that might seem like a straightforward conclusion, but it's really something that we need to keep in mind, because just because we're an environmentally minded community doesn't mean that these projects are going to get built. And so how are we fostering community conversation? If the end goal is an offshore wind conversation, how are we fostering that conversation about what we're willing to have an adverse impact to? And so that goes into the development process. The development process does not adequately take climate change into account. We're moving in that direction. There's a lot of folks who are using NEPA and CEQA in ways that take into account climate change. And I think government officials are moving in that direction of making climate a required section of environmental review. But we're not there yet. And it's certainly not that prominent of a factor in the state and local permitting processes. So it's going to be really important for us to have a conversation about how we are placing climate change both in our community conversations and in our legal development processes, so that an informed public can be able to say, well, this is the impact of doing nothing, and this is the impact of doing a project, and are we okay with this? So just to briefly kind of sum up what I've talked about here, stakeholders see various benefits. They see that the project could potentially reduce fossil fuel emissions. They think that it could create jobs in the community. But there are as many concerns, if not more concerns, and the concerns can potentially be more salient than what the benefits were described as. So if you have an increased conversation about visual impacts, and you find out that there's going to be a lot of impacts to marine mammals and avian species, a lot of those concerns can absolutely outweigh those benefits listed in the beginning of the presentation. In terms of process, there has been extensive engagement so far, both by the community and by others, but federal government, state government, but there are improvements needed. And again, those improvements are including climate change in the development process, including non-federally recognized tribes, including more conversations about community ownership paradigms. And finally, in terms of climate change, concerns about climate change largely did not supersede project concerns. The community is just really undecided on that point. So in conclusion, I just want to briefly describe what we should be thinking about for future research. Number one, This stakeholder analysis, again, was conducted in 2018 and 2019, and this conversation is going to keep evolving. Remember Cape Wind, where 55% were in favor, and just 4 years later, that completely flipped. So we're going to need to keep coming back and having community conversations about this project idea. And then second, there needs to be tribal stakeholder work specifically. That should be the focus, and including some of the federal and state regulations that would affect the process. And then you also might consider analysis of past development projects. So a lot of folks have asked me about the TerraGen project and why it failed and what happened. I think that it would be really meaningful to have another grad student or somebody in the community really kind of foster out what went wrong and why folks felt like they were not engaged on that project, and what did the developers do wrong, and really kind of analyzing that project and other projects, because knowing what our community is concerned about is the way that we move forward. And then finally, again, let's have some conversations about community development and local ownership paradigms, because stakeholders interviewed in this thesis were very, very, very interested in that local control piece and having that local accountability. So really sussing out what that could look like would be really beneficial. So again, thank you for attending tonight. I know that was a lot, but I'm really glad that you stuck with me here, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Just briefly, these are the just a couple of the sources that I cited tonight, if you were interested, and I will turn it back over to answer some questions.
Thanks, Ciara. So we just have a couple questions, and folks, remember you can enter questions into the chat and then I'll direct them towards Ciara. So our first question comes from Carol, who asks, why are these projects so large? Why can't wind power be scaled down and diversified?
Sure. So if you're talking about offshore wind specifically, one of the biggest issues is that it's really expensive. So developing this floating technology, and even just simply paying for the cables to go all the way back to shore, that is extremely expensive. And then the purchasing of the lease itself is more expensive than onshore land acquisition for onshore wind. So I would say that probably my first answer would be it's the cost. When you start to have this technology becoming more cheap, and if you have a way to make like the environmental review and the permitting processes more cheap, then you could potentially have a conversation about a smaller wind array. But it also depends on which leasing process you're using. So arguably, and I actually didn't mention this, but there is a third kind of route under the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and that's for small research or demonstration projects. So some folks have used that as a way to kind of test their technology. There are ways to do it, but largely it's cost.
Thanks, Ciara. So we have a sort of clarifying comment from Michael Winkler,
Sure.
who says that apparently Principal Power made the initial contact with the RCEA first, and then the RCEA did the RFQ process later.
Sure. So Michael would know. He's on the Redwood Coast Energy Authority board. So thanks for that, Michael.
So we have a question from Pat and Val. Has the Vineyard Wind Project been funded? Are you
So what happens is these developers, they form usually some kind of LLC, and the LLC will include their funder. So for instance, some of the big funders are like EDP Renewables, and they are working with RCEA. I don't know what, I know that part of Vineyard Power's cooperative has some sort of buy-in that would not fund the project. So I don't know specifically who their funders are or if they're looking for more.
All right, so our next question comes from Kathy, who asks, do you think this current fire season will increase the public sense of urgency around climate change?
So that's outside of the scope of my research. I did not survey the community broadly about their perceptions of climate change and how that translated to some sort of urgency. I would say that it depends on what the proposal is. So just because folks are feeling a sense of urgency doesn't mean there's any direction for them to throw that urgency into. So if there were a current offshore wind development process, would a giant wildfire turn the statistical support? I'm not sure. Something tells me probably not.
Thanks for that. So the next question is from Jem Zolik. If we think that OSW is important, how can we make a local project work? What do local stakeholders need? What do fishermen need? And how do we successfully engage our community to make this work?
Sure. So what do we need? Stakeholders told me, again, they would really like to see some sort of local ownership piece. They would really like to see some sort of local buy-in. And so a lot of folks were feeling very positive about the Redwood Coast Energy Authority being on a team of partners to pursue a lease. That's why I'm particularly interested in this cooperation, sort of local ownership conversation. Do I think that it meshes in with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management leasing process? Not particularly. So if we're having a conversation about the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is gonna sell off 3 leases, how can we make that a popular thing? I think that the first step is always increasing engagement. And one of the things that I have learned just from having conversations like this after the conclusion of my data collection work is that there's not one clear entity that can lead the stakeholder effort. So the Redwood Coast Energy Authority will say, well, we've been having a lot of conversations, but in this context, they're considered a developer. So they are invested in pursuing a project. So does that make them the ideal person to just be leading all of these stakeholder conversations? Perhaps not. And I think that Matthew Marshall might say the same thing. SHOTS will say potentially the same thing as well. They're a research organization. They're not a community building organization necessarily. And so perhaps it's an organization like the Humboldt Area Foundation or somebody that can get together and foster key stakeholders in the same room to continue engagement, to really suss out what exactly do the fishermen need. If it's a community fund, how much needs to be in the community fund? If it's an ice and cold storage project, where is that located? To just really kind of list out what different stakeholders need to feel okay. The other piece of that is there's a lot of unknowns right now. So like I said, visual impacts, for instance, the ways that stakeholders feel about certain things changes as more information is learned, as more groups come out for or against, as a particular issue like visual impacts is politicized, as is the Cape Wind case. There's a reason why everybody associates Cape Wind with visual impacts, even though it was wildlife impacts that were the biggest concern, and it's because that issue was politicized. And so we need to learn more. There needs to actually be a project, and there needs to be a leader who can facilitate these community conversations in a more regular way.
Thanks, Ciara. So we have a question from Dan Chandler, who writes, in the second SHOTS presentation, they showed a list of about 50 bureaucratic agencies that will think they have a say in this decision. Do you have any suggestions for how to cut through some of this red tape?
Well, Dan, that's exactly why I kind of didn't mention that in this presentation. Yeah, there's a ton of agencies that will have a say, and I think that, if I were a developer, you kind of take it one thing at a time. So nobody even has a lease yet, and without a lease, some of these agencies have already been engaged by developers, and the state has already convened meetings. And I think I'm thinking specifically of the California Energy Commission, people are trying to come up with a way to bring everybody together early so that you don't have roadblocks later. And that absolutely includes state and federal agencies. But first, you need to have a lease auction, which has already been delayed. And you need to have developers who are interested in pursuing those leases, which there are. And once you have those leases obtained, then I think the developers will strategically think about how to include everybody in the same conversation as opposed to going to folks individually.
Thank you. So we have a question from Maya Chelly, who asks, Ciara, if you were to interview local constituencies now regarding offshore wind, what materials would you most want to have on hand? So research, results, visualizations, a policy map, that sort of thing.
Well, Maya, I think, and you may be suspecting this already, I think that those visualizations of the viewshed are going to be key. You don't want people to think that they're going to see something that they're not going to see. And conversely, you don't want to look like you're somehow hiding the viewshed concerns. So you want to be really clear from the beginning. Well, here's what our modeling is indicating, and this is what we expect you'll be viewing. And I would actually be particularly curious about what the perceptions of how the wind turbines will look in the bay. I think a lot of people have been speculating about, well, what's the array going to look like once it's already in the ocean? But I almost suspect that there might be a bigger issue just knowing how large these things are. There might be a bigger issue with folks concerned about literally a bay viewshed. So I would definitely bring those along with me, and I would be really interested in sussing that out further. I think that would be the main thing. Thinking back to the concerns that the stakeholders listed in 2018 and 2019, I do think that it would also be really important to have, what do we know about bird avoidance? And what do we know about, and I know that SHOTS is already doing this, where they're putting a turbine or an array to scale with a whale, and really showing people how much smaller the whale is as opposed to the wind array. Doing things like that, it's going to be important to have clear information about those environmental impacts to mammals and birds, because folks were really concerned about that already.
Thanks. So we have a couple more questions that are sort of addressing impact specifically. So, Barbara Peters asks about, climate change potentially bringing bigger storms that could threaten the rigs. So do you have you looked at any sort of risk analysis for offshore wind turbines?
Yeah, that is not in the scope of my thesis. SHOTS did some stuff on that, I think. But really, the developers themselves are working that out, and that's so speculative, I couldn't say. I know that there are floating platforms that have survived significant winter storms already. So floating platforms are absolutely already in the water, and they have already held up to extreme waves and stuff and storms. But what I will say is that the fishermen are particularly skeptical about a wind array holding up. And, you know, they'll tell you how many times that they've seen buoys washed up in Humboldt County because of storms that we have here. And it would certainly be very dangerous for mariners if a part of the array became unhooked or something and was floating. So folks have thought of that, and that's a concern, and developers are going to have to address that.
Thank you. So looks like our last question comes from Chip Sharp, who is asking about comparisons between the environmental costs and benefits of wind farms compared to distributed photovoltaics.
So again, that's not in the scope of my thesis work. I did no sort of cost benefit analysis. I have heard colloquially that, quite frankly, the photovoltaic conversation on the North Coast couldn't go anywhere near the amount of energy that we could get offshore. That's just what I'm pulling out of the top of my head from what I've heard other people say. That's not my area of expertise.
Okay, thank you. So it looks like we have another question from Jeffrey Robinson, who asks, is it feasible to form a municipal entity to maintain ownership and operation of an ocean array?
I think the first thing that I would say is that would be pretty risky. One of the other things that has made the offshore wind, the floating offshore wind specifically, lagging is an investor's concerns about liability. And I had conversations with developers. Principal Power, I think, was the first developer who had a viable project where it had commercial liability. Beforehand, developers were having to kind of upfront funding these things themselves because they couldn't, investors were really weary about the liability of them. So I'm not saying no. I think that's exactly why we need to have a conversation about what community or cooperative ownership could look like. I think some sort of municipal entity, I just think liability would have to, you'd have to come up with some creative ways to deal with a liability issue.
Sorry, we have a long question. I'm just reading it out. So we're getting a lot of sort of technical questions about like near offshore wind versus floating offshore. Ciara, is that something?
Well, it depends on the question.
Okay, yeah, sorry. So, so from John, thank you for your talk. Apparently fixed bottom and wind turbines in depths less than 100 feet could be installed near offshore in Humboldt up to a mile from the beach. Did stakeholders distinguish between near offshore and far out floating offshore?
So we specifically were talking about floating offshore. I have not heard of developers who were seriously considering fixed bottom that close to shore, and that would really require its own stakeholder research, because then you really have a conversation about those visual impacts, and it would be a totally different process. So you wouldn't have the federal government involved, as long as it's 2 or 3 miles in. It's 2 or 3 miles to 300 miles. That is the federal waters. And somebody will correct me on that, I'm sure. But I haven't heard that the state is pursuing that idea. I haven't heard of any developers seriously considering that idea. And that would definitely have different stakeholder impacts altogether.
So thank you. We have another question about
but
title.
really, really quick, I just want to say, just because I haven't heard of it doesn't mean it's not out there. That just didn't come up in any of my research.
Thanks. So we have a question about tidal energy. Was that considered?
So the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has renewable energy leases. Perhaps arguably you could obtain a lease for tidal energy, although I have not heard of tidal energy being that far offshore. And I could also be wrong on that. They might be limiting them to wind turbines specifically, but if they aren't, again, I haven't heard of tidal energy being that far offshore. So again, if you're talking about something near shore, I know that there was a tidal energy conversation in Oregon, and that perhaps didn't go that well. So there's research out there, and again, that would be a different project, and a different, it would need a totally different stakeholder analysis.
Okay, so I have a question from Pat and Val.
Sure.
From your research, any thoughts on how people might become so concerned about climate change that they would be more receptive to the impacts they perceive offshore wind to have?
So I think the important thing to chat about here, and there are HSC professors I'm thinking of, like Ciara Emery, who just wrote a book on climate anxiety. There are people who will tell you that development projects do not get built out of fear, generally speaking. When you're having a conversation about development in the face of climate change, you know, when there is a sense of urgency, what ends up happening is there's perhaps less environmental review. Take last chance grade as an example. The road is falling into the ocean. And the big concern there is that when it really starts to fall down, the California Transportation Agency, Caltrans, can use emergency policies to simply rebuild the road. And environmental groups don't want that, and the community doesn't necessarily want that. Other stakeholders don't necessarily want that. And so when you start operating off of this place of urgency, people tend to put other concerns on the wayside. And then you need to get into a conversation about, what does equitable development look like? What does socially just development look like? Who are we putting on the wayside by using a claim of urgency to build something? Things should be built responsibly, and stakeholders want things to be built responsibly. And so you don't want to cut corners to do anything. And sometimes that's what happens when we act from a place of urgency. I'm not saying there's no urgency in this situation. I just think that, number one, the public is not generally motivated by fear or urgency. Sorry, I should say fear obviously is separate from urgency, and the public is not motivated by fear. Does fear translate into urgency? Yes. So there's tons of literature on that. Ciara Emery has a book on climate anxiety that kind of talks about operating in this space of the apocalypse. That's not really my area of expertise. My whole point here is, if you want to have a conversation about development in Humboldt County, you need to bring everybody to the table, because that's the only way it's going to be successful.
Great, thanks so much. Looks like all the questions have been answered. So thank you so much, Ciara. And I think we might end a little early. So big thanks to everyone who attended. And again, thanks to our co-sponsors, which include EPIC, the Climate Action Campaign of the Humboldt Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, Humboldt Friends, 11th Hour, and the Coalition for Responsible Transportation Priorities. Thanks to Pat and Val for organizing this event. And again, thanks to Ciara. If you're new to 350 Humboldt, check us out, check out our website. It's 350 world.350.org/Humboldt. And you'll be able to find a recording of this talk on our website. You'll also be able to sign up for notifications about actions, meeting, talks, and events. And you can follow us on social media. So thanks everyone. Have a wonderful night, and we look forward to continuing this conversation.